Just to kind of start off, you've had quite the professional career, what, maybe 21 years in HR, and then general counsel for private practices associates.
Right.
What?
So I've had 20 years in HR, 20 years in human resources, and in healthcare, and they do overlap.
Yeah.
It's 35 years total this year.
Wow. Tell me about your HR career. What got you into HR? What are some of the things that you did? What were some of the best moments and the worst moments?
Sure. The first thing I did in HR, I was promoted to an associate administrator role at Clarkson Hospital, so what they call vice presidents today. And one of the first areas I had responsibility was, well, back then we called it personnel. And so it was compensation, benefits, employee relations, everything, training and education, everything that went around HR in those days. And so my first role in HR was an unusual one because I was the one responsible, the head of it, where those folks reported to me. And so they taught it to me opposite the way you'd usually learn. Usually in HR, you start out as an HR assistant, you work into an admin role, things like that. But they really taught it to me. So that was, and thank goodness, everybody was there and skilled professionals and willing to teach me. Then I moved on to UNMC where I didn't do HR. That was about 2 years. And then I went back into I went into, for the first time, the publicly traded for-profit world. And there was a job at a place called MFS Communications. It was a Kiewit spinoff. It was later purchased by WorldCom Communications. If you remember Bernie Ebbers' fame, who ended up, I think, serving some federal time.
Yeah.
But before we were acquired, I was director of HR over there, and I was responsible for comp and benefits and employee and policies and procedures, things like that. And so then I got to take advantage of my international studies major and traveled the world, educating people about benefits packages and compensation packages and designing them and working on those.
How big was MFS at the time?
Oh gosh. I can't remember whether it was 1,000 or 2,000 employees.
Okay.
And we were in Europe and, this is going back a long way. All over the US. We had subsidiaries, and it was a telecommunications firm. And it was just at the beginning of the fiber and internet protocol technology. And so I remember taking a class that was, what was it called? Internet for Dummies.
Almost before the internet. Yeah.
Yeah.
As we know it, right?
Well, the internet was there, but it was learning how the packets follow through the lines and eventually come back together in messages and how the security worked. It was an internet engineering course for dummies.
Okay. And did that later become level 3?
Sort of. So MFS was purchased by WorldCom, and so it went away, but the management team stayed in place and did something very similar, concentrating really. So MFS was more of the cable lane and things like that, the more traditional telecommunications, where level 3 went into the new technology. And that same management team that was at MFS moved over to level 3.
Okay.
And so when it became level 3, then I had a baby the day after I left MFS, my last day of work.
Oh, wow.
And then was hired to start, that was the end of June of 1997, January 1st, 1998, or January 2nd. I started with PKS Information Services that had become a subsidiary of level 3 because, again, all of us were Kiewit spinoffs.
Okay. And where'd you go from there?
PKS, then we ended up selling that business unit. I had a little spade in there of 20 months a piece. And then I spent 8 years at Valmont as the vice president of HR, which Valmont is one of the finest companies you will ever come across. Talk about sticking to the highest of ethical standards. It is quite amazing, quite amazing.
Okay. And you left there to go to, is it the Private Practice Associates?
No, I took a little stint at Gordman's for
Okay.
about 9 months, where the most devoted employees to a mission I've ever run across, at least equaling healthcare, if not a little bit higher. I mean, these retail employees are fanatics about making sure that they're finding the right products for their customers and then delivering that service and quality level and at the price point. And just amazing people. So I'm a mission driven person. And while they found that mission driving them, I needed to go back into something where it was more mission for me. So that's when I went back into healthcare.
And what is Private Practice Associates?
So it's a business that was started, oh gosh, now probably almost 20 years ago. I think it was 1991. It started when the university and Clarkson Hospital joined together. And so university physicians, the academic physicians, had an employer who could speak for them sort of as a group. But the private practice physicians are all separate businesses on their own. And so they came together to form this communication vehicle to begin with, but then we ended up having a group purchasing organization, an organization called Paramount Group under our umbrella, where we negotiated the contracts with managed care companies, paying attention every step of the way to antitrust, never violating those. But really at the base is to handle the business for physicians so they can concentrate on patient care.
Okay. And so all along, Brad has his political career too, right? And so
Exactly.
You're real close to politics, and you kind of even come from a political family.
Well, only late in my life, because my dad didn't run until he was retired from being a heart surgeon. So my growing up years, you know, I mean, I had knowledge of it, and I've always voted. I don't think I've ever missed an election. If I did, I must have been in a coma. But so growing up, it was always something that was of interest to me, but never had family in it.
Uh-huh. Now, you were a Republican for most of your life?
I was. I kept thinking that, you know, that what first drew me to the Republican Party is it was sort of that stay out of my bedroom, stay out of my wallet, which was a more socially, the terms we use today, much more socially liberal, a lot more fiscally conservative. I changed over the years. I was always socially liberal, but I became not so much of a fiscal conservative anymore. I am a true moderate, and understand the role of government and understand the role and the need for some government spending. Not unnecessary, you know, and not regulation for regulation's sense, but we need common sense regulations that just that put those parameters around the unrestrained capitalism, because unrestrained market and free market and capitalism, it's never going to completely work. So you need some guide rails to make sure that you're behaving yourselves and not damaging people or the earth or just general morality or ethics. And once the 2016 election occurred, I knew that I could no longer try to change that party from the inside, which is what I always dreamt I could do. And it was no longer realistic. And so I changed parties, because what I saw was the Democrats truly accepting this broad swath of people. As long as you have those same general principles and goals, they allow you to get there from different ways. And to have something that I thought I had belonged to back in my 20s in the Republican Party, but it wasn't, it had changed so much, that was so accepting of a diversity of opinions and an acceptance of and a tolerance for different ways to get to the same end without questioning people's motives. And that's what I saw in the Democratic Party, and I couldn't be happier.
Okay. Of course, there's kind of this big fight within the Democratic Party. How do you see that kind of settling out?
Sure. But, you know, sometimes what has to happen is that the far ends of anything battle it out to get us back to the middle I think across the board, 70% of us are somewhere in that spectrum of being centrists or moderates. And then there's 15% on either side. And the problem with today in media, no offense, but all the attention is gobbled up by the far corners of either party because they're really loud. And that's where the excitement is. And that's where the clickbait is. And that's where people turn on to the news to see it or read the paper to see it. And it's sort of boring, and I get it, to report and say, well, gosh, these people went to work and did their job today. Not very exciting.
No, it can't be. No, we kind of have a theory of building the news, not breaking it. And
exactly.
Yeah, exactly. I think that can kind of fit. So you raised over $284,000 so far by the latest disclosure.
So far.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about where that came from.
It comes from here, from Nebraskans. Very little of it is from outside of the state. If it is, it usually is because I have a close friend or family member that I grew up with, and they no longer live in Nebraska. So what I've gone to is the people who I want to represent. And that's where I've raised my money. I haven't gone to these outside PACs. My major opponent in this primary has decided that her best course of action is to go to sources outside of this district because there's not a big appetite for her viewpoints within the district.
Well, it will be an expensive race.
It is always an expensive race. It's atrocious how much money we spend on politics. It really is. When you think of 435 members of the House, and we have an inexpensive market here. And when you think of some of those districts and what they're raising, and then you look at the Senate campaigns, and then you look at the presidential campaigns, and then you look at state legislatures and school boards and everything else. Right now, it's probably a good thing because it's keeping people in jobs, all of those vendors that act in that space. But overall, it's really pretty silly that we spend that kind of money.
Well, let me ask you about that. What do we do about money in politics?
So one of the first things we need to do is, I don't know whether it's going to take a constitutional amendment or what, but we need to counteract Citizens United, which I think is up there in one of the top worst decisions by the Supreme Court. And allowing corporations to somehow have this freedom of speech the same way as we as individuals who are Americans have it, that doesn't make any sense, because all that's allowed is this proliferation of the dark money. I'm always fascinated by people's concerns with corporate PACs, and I don't have any corporate PAC money, but making them out to be the bad guys, they turn the narrative around. And corporate PACs, actually, there's no money that ever comes from a corporation. It's funded by individuals who happen to work for the corporation, and each one is listed. I have no problem with any entity that lists their donors. If they, so you see Ann Ashford gave to people who like mud. And I don't mean MUD, mud, dirt. And so you'll know that you should feel free to exercise your right to freedom of speech, but identify yourself at the same time and come clean. It's these dark money PACs that spend all of this money just basically throwing mud at the other side, no matter what it is, and never being held accountable. That's disgusting. So we need some kind of a law or a constitutional amendment, if that's what it's going to take, to counteract that and to prohibit that. And I think eventually, if we could get to public financing of campaigns, that's where we'd want to go.
Really?
I do. And I don't mean to be putting any of our wonderful campaign consultants out there out of work, but I think we just need to have some common sense. And one of the things is that this pandemic has really brought out into the bright light that's always been evident, but people tend, if it's not right in front of you, you don't always pay attention to it. And one of the things that it's brought out is how many people are hurting and how many people are on the edge. And so what we need to do is find different ways of spending our money and perhaps start taking care of some of the really serious issues that we have in this country before we start throwing it at slinging mud at your opponent.
Okay. Well, talking about issues, you were quoted telling the Black Caucus that you know how to get to the point where we can bring the costs down so healthcare is affordable and accessible and truly, truly universal. Tell me how you would do that.
So the first thing we need to do is start with the foundation that Obamacare began with. And that was to limit the amount of dollars that an insurance company can take out of the premium dollars to spend for their profit or their overhead administrative costs. We need to bring down the cost of pharmaceutical medications so I always, having been in healthcare, I always have to laugh because you have to use shorthand to get the message across. I get it. But when people talk about having Medicare negotiate prices with drug companies, Medicare doesn't negotiate with anybody else. They just come in and tell you what they're going to pay. So we need Medicare to do that with the drug companies as well. And then we need to have a public option that will induce the private insurers to compete with. We have to leave in the 10 covered essential services that the ACA put in place. So we cover pre-existing conditions, and we make sure that we're covering people when they have mental health issues, when they have obstetric issues, whatever they may be. And so you bring in a public option, though, that looks a lot like Medicare does today. You still have a deductible, but it should be scaled to what you can afford. And so a person who can afford to spend the full boat, whatever it may be, and it will still be less than the private insurance companies because they don't have marketing in there, they don't have profit built in. So if you can afford to pay for that full boat, you pay for it. If you can't, we find a way to pay for it for you. But there are so many ways. For example, every hospital has to have an electronic medical record now, a system. And there's these giant behemoths who sell these. And it comes down to basically 3, 4, or 5 of them that are selling them across the United States. And they've protected themselves because they don't allow them to be truly interoperable. And they cite that these are proprietary programs. Now, we need to stop duplicating tests and duplicating the obtaining of information by having them interoperable so you can go and get that information. Excuse me. Another thing that nobody ever talks about is that when a hospital here goes to buy a new piece of equipment, on average, or even medical supplies, any provider, on average, our providers here in the US are spending between 500% and 300% more than providers in other countries because we don't put any limits on them. But other countries say, no, we're not going to pay more than $100,000. And so we're getting charged $300,000. And that's ridiculous. And then finally, and this is something that has been on my plate since Lee Terry was in Congress, and it's probably 18 years ago. And I know Lee, and I saw him someplace, and one of his staffers stopped me before I had a chance to talk to him. So I talked to the staffer and I said, here's the deal. We have to stop prescription drug advertising like we have on TV because it drives up the costs. Not only what the drug companies are spending, which is around $9 billion a year now in those direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical ads, but in causing patients to go then to physicians' offices and say, hey, I need a test for this condition I heard about on TV. And so they're not satisfied until they get that diagnostics. Well, let's say they do end up with the condition. And then they're demanding the brand name drug where the doctor knows perhaps a baby aspirin or eating an orange a day or whatever it may be we should try that first before we move on to this next level. So, excuse me, Jerry Nadler, a number of years ago, had put in place he wanted to do a bill that would make the expenses for the marketing that the pharmaceutical companies were doing non-deductible on their income taxes. They didn't go anywhere. So this is why I don't talk. This is why I listen.
Take a sip. You're fine.
What we could do, though, is limit it to other companies allow it in some cases, but you would limit it to either you can advertise a class of drugs but never your own brand name, or you can advertise a condition and never the kind of drugs. And you just say at the end of it, if you have these symptoms, you might have this condition, you should go see a physician to see if there's medication that can help you. And the same with the class of drugs. If you have high blood pressure, this class of drugs could help you, go see your physician to see if it does.
How do we get enough GPs into the system to take care of these people?
That is the question for ages, because for a lot of my career in healthcare and in human resources, I'm responsible for recruitment. And to find individuals, so it starts back with, are we starting those pipelines? UNMC has a great pipeline started through their high school baccalaureate program for health professions, where they bring in high school students and they are there on campus at UNMC part-time during the school year. That starts it. We need to start with looking at the student debt that they're piling up, because I don't know the most recent figure, but it used to be $250,000 was the minimum debt any physician would graduate with. It's up from there now. I think it's $350,000. And that's just unsustainable. And people look at that price tag and say, I can't do that. We need to look at how we are using nurse practitioners and physicians' assistants, what they can do and to spread some of the load out so the physicians can concentrate on other things. And we just need to look at more and more incentives to get people into those fields.
Now, let me ask you this. Of course, you know, we need to get to a majority in Congress. We need to get to a even bigger majority in the Senate, or House versus the Senate. How do we bring these sides together?
You just start finding people that have the same goal. It's the same way, it's what attracted me to the Democratic Party. It's okay if we have the same goal. We can start from there. We all have good motivations. Let's not question anybody's motives. So we all have this, so I use the example of pre-existing conditions. I really honestly haven't met anybody that doesn't want pre-existing conditions covered. So it should take us about 45 minutes in a room, really. If we all just said, do we all agree on this? Then let's set this aside and get it done. And so you just find where you can agree on things. And there's a lot more to agree on than anybody would have you believe. And we need to sit in a room and shut out all the outside forces, whether it's a lobbyist or whether it's another special interest group or whatever it may be, and come up with those answers. And I think we can do it. I think the will is there. And I think maybe now, I hope, because there are not a lot of silver linings to this situation that we're in now, with lives and livelihoods affected. But I hope that we come out the other end better for this, and we're willing to say, we have to stop this just divisive rhetoric, and we need to actually work together to get things done, and just stop it. Stop acting like children.
Mm-hmm. And so do you think both sides kind of have equal responsibility in that?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Both sides, you can find just heroes on either side, and you can find just really devils on either side. And we need to stop. I find it fascinating when candidates say, I'm running for office because I know we can get things done, and I know we can bring things together in one breath, and a second later, without even taking another breath, they're saying, and so I'm speaking from a Democratic side, they're saying, oh, but those Republicans, they're all awful. Mm-hmm. You just ruined your chances of being able to work together. I cannot stand labels. There's a caucus in the House called the No Labels Caucus. And more power to them, because that's where we have to go to. 35 years of working in this district, I never once asked my coworkers or those I reported to or those I was assisting, by the way, what's your party?
Mm-hmm.
No one cares. No one cares. They really don't. It's an inside baseball kind of game. And so what we need to do is throw those labels out and just start working together.
Okay. Let me ask you about education. One of the things that you talk about is funding universal pre-K. Mm-hmm. How would we pay for that?
We got a lot to pay for now, don't we? We're just going to need to, we're going to need to find ways to pay for everything. If we can bring some of the costs down for programs like the current Medicare and the drug prices that we're paying, and put some of those guardrails again in place on how much we're paying for equipment and things, so we can lower the rates that we're paying for some of the procedures and things. We're going to need to look and see whether or not in the military, and we need a robust, strong military, don't get me wrong, but are we spending money on equipment that is outdated and that will never be used? Are we upkeeping, doing maintenance on equipment, or replacing equipment or parts on equipment that we no longer have any use for? And so we just need to look in every single corner. The last thing I'm going to look for is tax increases, except for on the very high income. We need to look and see, does that make sense? Or do we need to raise those rates a bit more? And I'm not saying I'm going to go there right away, but we need to look at that. And on corporations, when we did that corporate tax cut, when Congress put that in place, I don't think we needed to go as much as we did. We probably could have gone halfway there and achieved the same ends that we wanted to achieve. And so we're going to need to look and see what makes sense now. But there's going to be so many competing interests.
Where do you stand on the wealth tax?
On the wealth tax, I just don't have any idea how you would ever do it. Because trying to get a full listing of every asset that a person owns and trying to attach a value to it, what happens if my mom's an artist? She usually does.
Can you hear me, Ann?
Yep, now I can.
Okay, you're back. All right, okay. Your mom's an artist. That's where I lost you.
Yeah, so my mom's an artist and she's never really sold her work. But what happens if under a wealth tax, they come through and say, okay, well, you have 5 paintings by your mother and we've determined that they're worth $1,000 each. Or whatever the case is, it's too hard to administer, and it doesn't make sense to me. I think what you have to do is do it on the income tax. And what you have to look at too is, for example, who is it? The hedge fund guys who make their total income off of trading. And so every piece of and that's their work income. That's what you and I work for the paycheck for. To have those taxed at capital gains rates, that's not fair. That's not right. So we just need to take a fine-tooth comb through everything and look at it.
Okay. You touched on some other issues that are deadlocked. So I'd like to get your thoughts on how and who we need to bring to the table for getting a truly bipartisan solution.
Okay.
Gun control.
So one of the things I think we need to do is, one of the things that I'd like to see put back in place is an assault weapons ban. We had one for 10 years. We can certainly do it again. But the way you achieve that is that you bring together a commission of law enforcement, of health professionals, have military members there, have people who understand these weapons there, and some lawmakers in the room. And you figure out, what is the definition of an assault weapon? I'm not qualified to tell you that. I'm not qualified to tell you what's too dangerous to be on the street. I'm going to react as a mom every step of that way. That's just, I'm being very honest there. And so somebody else needs to tell me what truly is qualified to be too dangerous to be on the streets, so we can find common ground around things like that. I've talked to gun dealers who they don't have a problem with universal background checks. They are under those regulations now. What it would stop is the gun show sales and other sales that would take place over the internet or whatever. They would have to go through the background checks too. We need to have universal background checks. We need to have some funding put toward research into the causes of gun violence. So there are many times when we can prevent incidents of gun violence, and there are times when we can't. I have a friend that I worked with at MFS who was the most wonderful guy and committed suicide by gun. There's not a gun regulation in this world that would have stopped that. Mm-hmm. And that's sad, but that's the issue. And so we need to understand it's not always something that can be regulated away, but everything that we could put a stop to, we need to do it.
Well, let me go back to, getting everybody in the room and cutting out the special interests, because when that group leaves the room, they'll have somebody like the NRA just screaming at them. And how do we get through that?
Get some steel spines. I mean, grow up. Just get some steel spines and just say, you know what? One of my frustrations with members of Congress who come back to a district and send beautiful letters or attend events and say, gosh, I'm with you. I've always been with you. That's it. And they go back directly and vote the next day against the interests of the people who they just told they were with. Get some steel spines and grow up and be able to say, my district wants this. The people who voted for me want this. The people who I represent want this, and it's not what you're selling. So I'm sorry, but I think those special interest groups, one of the things that's good about all the rabble rousing that's going around now too, is that some of the special interest groups are losing that power. And I remember when Brad was in Congress talking to Republican spouses, and one of the things that they were always scared to death about was were their husbands, they always tended to be wives, were their husbands going to get primaried from the right? Mm-hmm. And now we have a situation in the Democratic Party with people worrying about, am I going to get primaried from the left? Again, you need to have some moxie. You need to have a steel spine and say, I'm going to do the job for my district and the job that my district sent me to do. And hopefully I won't get primaried, but if I do, so be it.
Okay. What would you do about immigration? How can we find a bipartisan solution around that?
I think that there is bipartisan support for the DACA students. And so we need to finally put that, if we get away from the loud voices in the room, I think we can get a bill passed. It passed in the House. And, I think one of our big roadblocks is that we need to replace Senator McConnell, but he's not our district. So hopefully they're going to vote right. But we need to put actual legislative protections in place for the DACA recipients and their families, and we need to push for enact a pathway to citizenship for those individuals. There's no excuse for that. We should never have a policy that separates children and families at the border. Mm-hmm. We should never have a policy that allows incarceration of any individual within these borders. I don't care where you're from, whether it's a felon who's committed a crime in this country, who's a citizen, or a person seeking citizenship. There's no place for any kind of a for-profit entity housing those individuals. That's completely, it's not ethical in my book. We need to have more immigration judges. We need to make sure that people who are seeking asylum here are allowed into the country, to have them stop outside of the walls of this country. And we shouldn't have a wall, by the way. We should rely on 21st century technology to monitor our borders rather than 10th century, I think it was built in, the Chinese wall, the Great Wall. We don't need a wall. We need secure borders, but there are different ways to do it. And, but for those individuals to have to stop before they can come in this country and go back to their point of origin, if someone's seeking asylum, it's pretty darn serious. And I can't imagine myself, my friends, my family members, any one of us being ever in that desperate of a state where you must seek asylum somewhere else and make a treacherous journey to, with any luck, get it and not be guaranteed it.
What about all of the parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents of the DACA kids? The ones that have been here 10, 20 years?
So that's why I think the DACA kids and their immediate families need to have a pathway to citizenship. So whoever brought them here, maybe their parents weren't living and their aunt and uncle brought them here or their grandparents brought them here, but whoever is in that household, they should be included in that same pathway.
And for those who didn't have kids, who came at the same time?
So then we're going to have to look at a different kind of program. And this pandemic and what it's done to our economy may sadly change that. Because we were in such need of employees right before this started. And there's still a need in some areas. And I've always been an advocate of upping the limit, for example, of H-1B visas. Having been in HR and being responsible for recruiting highly skilled individuals, which there's never enough of. It's just we can't turn them out fast enough. And so I was always a proponent of raising those caps, because the caps, I think they come open in April, if I remember right. It's been a while since I've done this. And if they came out in April, within a month, they were taken up. Mm-hmm. So we need to raise those caps. Now, how much we raise them as a result of what we're going through with the economy and trying to see where we're going to end up coming out of this and how we're going to come out of this, we may take a different look at that. I don't think we should shrink anymore. The number of immigrants that we allow into this country, but we're going to have to look at how much we expand.
What about all the ones that don't have the college degrees, but who really in a lot of ways are the backbone of the economy? The factory workers, the service workers, restaurants, right?
The meat packers. And in my past history, in my most recent job, we actually ran a clinic, started it and operated a clinic for a meatpacking plant here in town for the employees and their dependents. That was a beautifully run facility just for them, so they could have primary care without any expense to themselves, no copays, no deductibles, anything else. We have to have those individuals. And even with this awful economy, I have seen now, I was at Ace Hardware the other day buying some plants. And they had a sign up saying help wanted, please send anybody. And the young woman at the cashier's desk said, please, do you know of anybody? Would you please send them our way? So there are places looking for jobs. There are places that Americans won't apply. And so we need to look to, but we need to make sure that we are safeguarding those individuals who are coming in as immigrants. They need to come in with legal status, and we need to provide them with that legal status. And then make sure that they are still, because when they come in undocumented, the sad and awful thing about it is that they are treated like the dirt we were talking about before. Mm-hmm. They do not feel ever comfortable making an OSHA complaint. Mm-hmm. They do not feel ever comfortable asking for benefits that they should have, their health benefits. They do not feel ever comfortable reporting any kind of an issue to anybody. Wage and hour violations, whatever it is, because they're afraid that their undocumented status will be discovered and they will be deported.
Now, have they earned a path to citizenship?
I think so. I think that if you are here for a period of time and you're only I'm not even going to call it a crime, although many would. But your only transgression is that you are here in an undocumented status. But otherwise, you've been here for 20, 30 years and you've never had an issue, and you have paid taxes and you've paid Social Security and all of that. I think we need to find a way to provide a pathway to citizenship for you.
So my last big issue for you today, climate change. How do we get everybody together to do something about climate change?
That's lovely, isn't it? I think the will is there. I think that if we don't clean up our air and land and water, we don't really need to worry about what health plan we're going to have, because it's going to be a moot point. And so I think that the will is there. And I think that, again, if we just get people in rooms, tone down the rhetoric, stop with the talking points, and let's just talk about what's the reality. And the Paris Agreement is something that we need to rejoin. It did not put any kind of international control over US standards or anything else. It allows each country to set their targets and to reach their targets, and has assistance in doing so. We need to regain our place in the US as a steadfast, or in the world, the US needs to regain its place as a steadfast moral compass that is true to course. And I fear that during these last 3 years, we've presented a chaotic front where it is, no one ever knows exactly what to expect out of us. And it can change like that in a tweet. And that is not the way to do it, ever. And I think that, sadly, and I'm not going to talk about him much, but I think the president doesn't understand the true responsibility that he has, that everyone looks to him because it's normal, because of the office, for an example, and for setting the course, and for being that steadfast, moving forward, and leading us, truly leading us, instead of throwing out barbs here and there, and then saying, or throwing out comments and saying, oh, well, gosh, it was sarcasm. I don't think presidents, I think you have, once you are elected to that office, and I think probably down to Senate and House office and things, when you're speaking publicly, you do not have the luxury of sarcasm. Unless you state first, I'm going to be sarcastic. But you don't have the luxury of sarcasm. Do it in your own home, among the four walls, and make sure your Zoom's off. But otherwise, I think that leaders need to understand the solemnity of their duties and concentrate on doing those rather than trying to get these sound bites or win a poll on how many clicks you got or whatever.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the time. Any last word statements?
So 2 things we didn't cover. One is education. I strongly believe that what we haven't given enough discussion to is the plight of our K through 12 teachers and teaching staff, because there's plenty of folks who help the teachers as well, the paraprofessionals. And their pay is dependent upon what state and what district they work for. And it's not always, well, I've never heard anybody say, gosh, teachers are overpaid. And so on the federal level, I can't control that. But the first bill, one of the first bills that I would introduce that first day would be one that would exempt K through 12 teaching staff pay from federal taxation. Because I think we need something really big and bold to say, this is how much we value and we need that profession in our lives. If we do not have them, we are not what we are. And then the second thing is on the responsibility of a representative to really set the tone for a district and also make the next generation the opportunities for them available. And so I have pledged that a minimum, and it is a minimum, it's not a maximum as some would have you think, it is a minimum of 25% of the district and the DC staff will be people of color, people who do not look like me. And one of my primary goals will be to mentor any individual who wants to be mentored, to be prepared to either run for office someday, take office someday, or be a staff member someday. If we're not doing the job of preparing that next generation, then we're not doing our job. So those are two thoughts that I think we didn't cover that I really find extraordinarily important.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great day.
You too.